In this video, we're going to talk about the various ways that we can select objects and view objects in our viewports. All right, so let's go ahead and open up the scene file m1_05_begin. To do that, we can go up to the quick access menu bar and go to open. And we don't want to save this, so I'm just going to hit don't save. And then it automatically brings me to my scenes folder if you've set up your project folder correctly. So with this, let's go ahead and hit open. And you'll see that it opens this particular scene. And now what we want to do is we want to talk about the different selection processes that we can use inside of 3ds Max. So to select an object, it's very simple. Let's just left click on an object and it's selected. Notice the blue highlight around it that indicates that it is currently selected. If you hover over an object, you'll get this yellow outline, and this tells us that an object can be selected. Now if I left click on this one, you'll notice that it deselects the sphere but then selects the teapot. Now what happens if I want both of them to be selected? We can hold down Control on our keyboard and then left click, and that will allow us to select multiple objects. And I can continue to select until I have everything selected in the scene. Now to select multiple objects, there's another way of doing that, and we can just simply left click and drag, and that will allow us to do a marquee selection. Now the shape of the marquee selection is determined by this right here. This button up here, if we click and hold on it, it will allow us to change the shape of the selection region. So we can use a circular pattern. We could use a pattern that will actually allow us to determine that shape. Let me show you how that's done. If I left click and drag out a line and then I release that, you'll notice that I still have this selection activated. So I can left click points, and I can click as many as I want until I go back to the beginning of that shape, and then it will only select what is inside of that selection region. Now there are other shapes for our selection region. We can use this one here where it just allows us to left click and drag, and it's kind of a lasso selection. And then finally we have spray, which allows us to left click and drag, and anything that it touches will be selected. Now there is a toggle next to our selection, and this works really well with everything but the spray. What this will do is it will toggle it from window mode to crossing, and right now by default we're in crossing. So anything that the marquee selection touches will be selected. But if we toggle that to windowed, anything that is completely encompassed by that selection region will only be selected. So it gives you a few options on how to select objects using that. Now that we've talked about selecting objects, let's talk about deselecting them. So let's select all of these, and then I'm going to hold down Alt and deselect the objects that I want to get rid of from that selection. So now that we have kind of an idea of how to select in the viewport, we also have the Scene Explorer, which we can select objects as well. So I can left click and select any object from this list, or I can hold down Control and select multiple. Now the holding down Alt and selecting will not do anything. Continue to hold down Control and then click on any object that is already selected, and it will deselect that. Okay. Now we also have the option of selecting Arrange. So if we select the first item and we hold down Shift, we can select this third one, and it selects the items in between that. So a couple of different ways that we can select multiple objects. Now we're going to get into a scene that's going to have lots of things going on, and this process is going to be very valuable to us. So now that we've talked about selection as a whole, let's talk about how we can view objects in our viewport, because this is going to be very important for us as well. So looking at the viewports, you'll notice that in our perspective view we can see a shaded colored view of all of our objects. But if we look in the top, front, and left, we have this wireframe view. Let's go ahead and select our perspective view and hit Alt-W, and let's take a look at how we can change the way this is viewed in the scene. And they're going to have their pros and cons to how we can select and view objects. So starting right here, we have Standard. Left click on that, and it's going to bring up a menu, and this is going to determine how the object performs in the viewport itself. So here we can see that we're using Standard. This is going to be on by default. We can switch this over to Performance, and what this does is it turns all color and materials and textures off. So it's just gray. We'll still have our lighting capabilities on this. Now, with this, we can also go to high quality, and it's going to turn our color, it's going to turn all of our textures on, and then it adds casted shadows to our geometry and also ambient occlusion. So we get this high quality look. Now, depending on the shaders that we use inside of 3ds Max, it will also show things like physical material. So metal will actually look like metal if it's set up properly. And so this particular view can get a little heavy on the performance of your PC. So if you're running a machine that doesn't have the best hardware, you might notice a little bit of struggle on more complex scenes using this mode. So easily you could switch it to standard and you should be okay. Now, next to that, we have the default shading, and this is going to determine how the object is physically viewed in the viewport itself. There are lots of different ways that we can view this. We have facets, which is going to turn off all smoothing. We have bounding box, which is going to completely get rid of the shape, but only show us the bounding box itself. Now, if we hover over those, you'll see that it gives us an idea of what the shape looks like of that particular object. This is going to be helpful if we have very complex scenes and we're just trying to get to a certain area, and then we can turn on the display again to show us the actual object. So that's how this is helpful. We have flat color, which gets rid of all shading. We have hidden line, which shows us the topology, but then makes it a very flat color. Then we have clay. I've seen this used whenever animators are working, and they're just trying to see the object deform, like characters and things like that. And then we have stylized, and there are lots of different options here. Now we also have wireframe. Wireframe is very helpful for us, so that way we can see through particular objects and we can select those. So let's say that there was a very small object in between the teapot and the cylinder. I could come in and I could select that. I find it easier with wireframe to select sub-objects like vertices or particular polygons or edges. Now we can back out of the wireframe and we can go to edge faces, but you'll notice that this is grayed out. Let's turn off that wireframe, and then let's go back to clay and then go to edge faces. Notice it shows us the topology on top of the shading that we have, so on top of that clay. This is going to be very helpful whenever we're modeling because it allows us to see the topology as we're modeling the object. Let's go ahead and switch it from clay. Let's go back to that default shading. This is particularly what we're going to see most of the time. So now that we've talked about selecting and viewing objects and how that's going to be helpful, let me leave you with just a couple of keyboard shortcuts that are going to really be helpful, specifically whenever viewing. If we hit F3 on the keyboard, that's going to switch it over to wireframe. If I hit F3 again, it's going to bring that standard shading back. If I hit F4, that will turn the edge faces on and off. So F3 to view the wireframe, F3 to bring it back, F4 to go to the shaded view with the edge faces. So with that, let's move on into our next lesson where we're going to talk about creating and manipulating geometry.